OShow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the OShow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the OShow. It's the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow.
Welcome to the OShow, Canada's conversation on the issues we have in common, solutions, and of course, bold opinions. I'm your host, Laura Babcock, and joining me on this episode of the pod, we are going to have none other than the former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne. But before we get into the conversation with Kathleen, here's some other things that the OShow is looking at for you. We're keeping our eye on what's happening federally with Pierre Poilievre and what seems to be his MAGA playbook. It's like he's campaigning like Trump did in 2016 with some of the rhetoric and some of the shenanigans that we've seen recently. I have an op-ed about it in the Toronto Star. You don't even have to like Trudeau or like the state of Canada, but do we want to be so angry at things that we go all in for Pierre Poilievre when he's saying and doing some things that are kind of disturbing? So we want to get into that. And I think I'll get in some great guests to talk about Pierre Poilievre on an upcoming pod. Also, if you've tried to get into a long-term care home, or if you have family that you're trying to arrange long-term care for, you know it's not easy. In fact, it can be extremely difficult and expensive. So we're going to speak on our next pod with Dr. Vivian, and she'll give us the real sense of how horrible the situation is in Ontario and what it looks like across Canada. Also, something we're following, of course, is the national housing crisis. We're going to keep talking about it here on the OShow because we have to look at whether Trudeau's new housing strategy, the wartime strategy, is going to take any kind of real effect and how soon that's going to be, and what other municipalities across this country are doing to try to mitigate homelessness, trying to build affordable housing as quickly as possible, or in the case of some communities, completely screwing it up and getting into stupid fights on council. Okay, it's time to get going. Let's talk to our guest, Kathleen Wynne. Welcome back to the OShow, former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne. And Kathleen, I'm so happy to have you here today because honestly, what's going on with Ontario and the Ford government and the decision to move and have an office in Ottawa. I mean, when you were Premier of Ontario, did you feel it was necessary to set up a second office in Ottawa and to spend tax dollars on what? I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah. Well, I was very surprised by that decision. I actually don't understand the point of it. We did have a representative in Washington, and honestly, I can tell you when President Trump was elected and we had to start dealing with the NAFTA issue, it was great that we had an office in Washington, but Ottawa, it's down the road, and there are members of his caucus who live in Ottawa and who can be his representatives. So I don't know how Lisa MacLeod feels about it, but it seems like a bit of overkill to me.
I was wondering during the convoy occupation of downtown Ottawa whether or not Ford realized that Ottawa was in fact in Ontario, but assuming that he did.
Yeah, it was strange. I was thinking about that too, Laura. He didn't go to Ottawa. He doesn't go to Ottawa. He seems to not go to Ottawa very often. So that, and I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem, and I understand that the Premier likes to get in his truck and talk to people. I get that. But there are people in Ottawa who would like to talk to him. There are people all over the province who'd like to talk to him. So I think it's an issue, and I don't think the issue is solved by hiring somebody, having a six-figure salary in Ottawa with an office with staff and so on. And in fact, it could actually kind of let the government off the hook, let the Premier off the hook, because it really should be a very immediate relationship between his government and the people in government in Ottawa. And so to say, well, we're going to sort of shut this off to another staff person as opposed to an elected representative or myself, the Premier, it doesn't make any sense to me. So yeah.
That's an interesting
We'll have to
take.
see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I think we're already seeing it, right? We've seen since then, maybe they're correlated, maybe they're not, Kathleen, but we've seen Sean Fraser, the housing minister, come out and say, you know what? We are bypassing Ford and sending money directly to municipalities for affordable housing in Ontario. I mean, if that doesn't signal to me that there is a rupture between the Premier's office and Prime Minister Trudeau's office, especially around the impetus or the imperative of housing. I mean, what was your take on that? Do you think their relationship is getting worse somehow? I mean, we saw the big auto announcement a while back. They look like they were attached at the hip, Trudeau and Ford. And now we're seeing the federal government say, no, Ontario, I read it, Kathleen, as we don't trust you to take this money and to apply it to affordable housing.
Well, to your first question, you know, if the signal about having somebody in Ottawa was that we want this close relationship, you know, we have had a close relationship, we want it to continue, that certainly has not been the case, you know. So that signal was not followed up with substance. And so on the housing file, I think it is very important that people pay attention to the fact that the reason the federal government is going to bypass the Ford government is that they are not meeting their targets, you know, so that all the ads that are being run by the Conservative Party of Ontario and all of the hype about how the focus of this government is housing, the targets that were set have not been reached. And so we have to really, and you know, even in the numbers that they are putting out, do those include the long-term care beds, you know, because they were talking about including those as part of their housing success. So I think that the reality that Sean Fraser, the federal minister, is saying we're going to deal with municipalities, and Paul Calandra, who's the housing minister provincially, has tried to say, oh, well, this is how it's been done forever. Well, that's not actually true. What's actually true is that there's been a partnership, you know, and that all three levels of government have worked together. And what the federal government is saying now is we actually don't have a partner in the province on housing. And so we're going to work with the municipalities. I think it's great that the money is going to flow to the municipalities, but way better if you had all three levels of government working together.
Well, it's so funny because I guess I'm getting more cynical with my age, Kathleen, because when you saw them moving an office to Ottawa as being a signal that they wanted to work more closely with the federal government, I thought quite the opposite. I thought it was more like saying, we've got to keep an eye on this federal government. It almost to me looked like a little bit more of a tactic to say, you know, you're on notice, Trudeau, than it did to have a better, closer relationship. Because to your point, the Premier can pick up the phone, and he's also got MPPs who are in the area who could be doing that work. So I saw that whole office set up as more of a tactic maybe by Conservative premiers to say, you know what, we got to watch Ottawa. So I love the fact that you thought it was to improve partnership.
Well, the point of having representatives in other cities, in other places, is to establish a relationship. So establish or embellish or expand a relationship. So I'm just giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, you know,
which I love. But let me go to this because I'm not. I don't know. Maybe
okay.
Former journalist in me. But speaking of benefit of the doubt, like when I heard that long-term care beds might be considered part of the housing numbers, and I'm going to have Dr. Vivian on the next pod here to talk about the crisis in long-term care because it's outrageous what's happening. But just that idea, I mean, the Ford government didn't meet their housing targets. And you made the point. We see what amounts to me, Kathleen, as gaslighting. I mean, I know that every province or every government puts out ads to say, look what we're doing, or highway signs, another project brought to you by so-and-so. It's incumbent advantage to do that. But I can't recall when I have seen so many videos put out that just feel to me like I'm part of this elaborate gaslighting campaign telling us how great it is it's happening here in Ontario. Like, what Ontario is Doug Ford living in? Because it's sure not the Ontario that I hear from OShow audience about, or that I see in my travels with clients, or that I see downtown Hamilton every weekend. I mean, this is not the Ontario that I think people are experiencing with closed ERs, you know, sporadically, where they're afraid of when they might get sick because they can't access an ER on the weekend. I mean, so have you ever seen a government invest so much in telling us that everything is tickety-boo when they're clearly missing targets and they've got a crisis in the healthcare system?
Well, I think that I think all governments try to tell their story, right? I mean, there's nothing unusual about that. Um, I think that right now the Conservative Party and the government, they're both spending a lot of money because there are some ads, the ads of Ford on the phone, those are paid by the party,
Right.
but the ads about how great everything is in Ontario, those are government ads. What worries me about them is that they're, the government ads. I mean, the partisan ads are something, they're separate, Laura. We can't begrudge a party paying money to build up their leader. I think that they're worried. I think that the number of the ads means that they think that they need to be doing that. So that's a good thing in terms of me as a liberal. I think that's great. But the second thing is that in terms of everything's great in Ontario, what worries me about it is they're not very specific. We ran a lot of ads, for example, when we were putting the cap and trade system in place, right? Because we wanted people to know that we were fighting climate change and that we had a plan. We'd run on that. But B, we also wanted to explain it to people, how it works, how the large emitters are taxed, and there's a cap on how much they can emit. So we felt that it was very important that people understand this thing because it's not self-evident, right? But these ads that the government is running are not specific. They're not explaining anything. They're not giving anybody information. They are just trying to make you feel good. I understand why you'd want to do that, but I don't think they're very informative. But I think people need to pay attention because it works, that kind of thing works over time. People get a sort of, and I will say, false sense of security that everything's okay. But as you say, there are lots of problems in healthcare. There are huge issues around the delivery of healthcare. There are big issues around education. I mean, there's an article in the paper this morning about, and there has been for a number of days now, that school boards are not seeing the funding that they need, and that programs are going to suffer, that kids are not going to get the service that they need. There are going to be fewer staff in schools, and the money, the government comes back and says, yes, but we've given, I think it's $700 million more. But the reality is that that's not keeping up with inflation. It's not covering baseline costs like CPP. And a lot of that money is for specific programs that the government has brought in, not the funding that the board needs to just keep the lights on and run the schools. So I think that, there's a reason the government wants to run these ads, because they want to distract from those issues. They also want to distract from all of the development issues that flow out of the Greenbelt stuff. That is not over by a long shot. They want to distract from the havoc that's going to be wrought by building the 413. So they do not want people thinking about those things. So they want them to have a good feeling about the government. And it's, I think it's quite dangerous because it doesn't give people a clear picture of what's going on.
The idea that everything is fine when it isn't, and there's no specificity, to your point, that's what makes it feel gaslighty, right? It's like it doesn't feel fair to me. I mean, our scandal panel that our audience can check out discussed the Ford ads as well. And, the thinking was, are they pressing advantage because they're leading in the polls, and so they're spending money to keep people feeling like they're the winning team all the way through? Is it just a Bonnie Crombie thing to try to define her before she can define herself and really lead? Or, to your idea, do they see something in their internal polling, maybe, or something coming down the pipe with these scandals like the Greenbelt, like you just alluded to, that they're afraid of? I mean, of those three buckets, Kathleen, which one?
Well, it could be a bit of all of the above, Laura. But I do think they're trying to put some goodwill in the bank. They're trying to put some goodwill in the bank in case something does happen around the Greenbelt. I think that they definitely see Bonnie Crombie as more of a threat than they saw Stephen Del Duca as a threat. So they need to really firm up that notion that everything's okay, so that if there is something negative that happens, they have they have a real foundation of people thinking, well, these guys are good and they're mainly doing good things, which, for those of us who really care about our public institutions, is not true. But I believe that's what they're trying to do now. I'm not part of their war room. and they're working within the rules in terms of the government ads, for sure. They have to do that. But the fact that they're running the partisan ads as well, that's where I get to, they're putting goodwill in the bank because they may or may not know what's coming down the line at them. But they sure do know that a general election with Bonnie Crombie as the leader of the Liberals is coming at them. And so they're trying to get out ahead of that, and they have the money, and they're able to do it. So,
and do you think that the by-election
that's
results,
the political game?
Well, and I mean, do you think the by-election results were indicative that it's working? I mean, one of them we thought was, of course, going to go Conservative, but the other one that was a tight race, Ford was positioning it as a repudiation of Bonnie as Liberal leader. I'm paraphrasing a little, but do you think that was an overstatement by the Premier?
I think that by-elections are really, really hard to interpret. I think it's very tough to say exactly what was going on. I think that, I went down and knocked on doors in Milton for a couple of days, and people really liked Galen. He didn't have a lot of time as the candidate to be established, but they did like him. I think there's a bit of a mix of the federal Liberals. The federal Liberals numbers are very bad. And so I think that that might have been part of it. And we lost by a little bit more than we had the last time, but it was still relatively close. So I can't tell you exactly what the rationale was, but part of that is for sure, Laura, that what the government has done to date has worked. People see Doug Ford as this good guy for the little people, even though he's the one who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. I mean, it's interesting where the truth gets lost in all of this, So the comparison between him and Bonnie Crombie, Bonnie being the child of a single mom, having not had anything, having had to work for every single thing that she's gotten in her life, and Doug Ford being this wealthy guy, walked into his dad's business, didn't have to scrape and claw and get an education. He just walked into his dad's business, and that's been his foundation in his life. And yet because he's a big blustery guy, he can convince people that he's on their side. More power to him. That's his political, I don't know, magic touch, whatever. But I really hope people pay attention closely to what's actually going on in their kids' schools, in their community hospitals, what's going on in terms of the housing that is or is not being developed. I mean, there's a bill, I'll stop my rant in a second, but there's a bill 185 that's going through the legislature right now. And, it would further remove planning from for example, from regional governments. Municipalities are going to have to be doing their planning. And you and I know, Laura, municipalities do not have the resources to do planning that is going to be coherent with, a good regional and provincial outcome. So they are further weakening the planning process and allowing, for example, developers to appeal decisions that citizens can't appeal. That's not democratic. But those things are buried in a bill that most people aren't paying attention to, but it will have a huge impact on people's lives. That's the kind of thing that I really hope people pay attention to.
Well, so there's a lot in your rant, and I love it. The OShow is for ranting and strong opinions, Kathleen, so never apologize or truncate a rant for my sake. But I want to unpack a couple of ideas that you've just brought up there. One of them is, let's just talk about this power dynamic between provincial and municipalities. I mean, the municipalities are the creature of the province, right? So the province can play with them like a cat does with a mouse. And we saw that with Ford. One of the first things he did was cut Toronto Council, right? Seemed like a little bit of a slap back from his time on council. But if you look at Alberta, what they're trying to remove, it seems to me, a lot of the autonomy or authority of municipalities, trying to wrest more control for the province, right? Almost, and I'm simplifying it here, but almost like kind of doing a veto on municipalities, which provinces have anyway, theoretically. You got the OMB for planning decisions and stuff like that, but in such a way that bringing partisan politics directly municipally, I mean, it's always been there behind the scenes, but it just feels like in Alberta, they're trying to, consolidate power around the provincial premier. And I can't help but think that that's what some of what's going on in that bill around planning decisions, make it easier for his developer pals from the Greenbelt scandal to get what they want, right? After he was pushed back by the people of the province back in September. But also it's this bigger, what I'm seeing is this bigger disturbing move towards consolidating power in the office of the premier. And that's never a good thing. I'm not partisan, but even if I was partisan, even if I was a liberal, which I'm not, and I was all like, rah, rah, Trudeau, I wouldn't want Trudeau to consolidate more power in the prime minister's office. He already has too much, by virtue of how the parliamentary system set up.
Yeah. And, so I think Alberta and Ontario are different cases. I mean, what worries me about Alberta is this kind of mission that Danielle Smith, the Premier Smith, seems to be on to isolate Alberta from the rest of the country. That really worries me. It worries me for the Federation. The notion that she floated about, removing Alberta from the Canada Pension Plan. Well, that would be bad for Albertans. My cousin who lives in Alberta would not be a good thing for him and his kids. So I really worry about some of her really, I think, offside ideas about how the Federation works. So that's a concern. And that kind of is consistent with her trying to take more power in the Premier's office, because she wants Alberta to be this self-sufficient entity.
Right.
In terms of
Wexit, is the Wexit?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I grew up in Montreal during what we can call now Kexit, when Quebec was trying to leave.
Yeah.
I lived through the first referendum. So I'm with you in terms of Danielle Smith's and the agenda of isolating Alberta. And there are a whole host of things I'm not loving about what's going on in Alberta. And I'll get a guest on from Alberta to dig through some of that stuff soon on the podcast. But I mean, and didn't she also put an office in Ottawa? I thought I saw that they put a satellite there as well, which kind of reminded me of what Ford is doing. So it seems to me
that actually makes more sense than the Ontario government doing that.
Sure.
Right?
If you're looking at it from the optimistic lens that you are, if you're looking at my cynical lens, then it's not better. It's part of a bigger movement. But I just want to pick up on the connection, because you referenced the Liberal federally and how they're doing poorly in the polls and how that might have affected the by-election in Ontario with Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals. Something happened today, Kathleen, and literally I just refreshed my Twitter feed and saw it. So I don't know if you've seen it yet. But for the first time, Premier Ford just used Axe the Tax, the federal conservative Poilievre's favorite.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sticker. And it's wild to me, because I just had an op-ed in the Toronto Star this morning talking about, or juxtaposing Pierre Poilievre's rhetoric from Trump's 2016 campaign rhetoric, right? And the fact that Canada is bruised. We're not broken. This is not American carnage level stuff up here. But I detail in the op-ed a number of similarities that I see. And one of them is these 3-word Axe the Tax, drain the swamp, jail not bail, we build the wall. Like we're seeing this, the substance might be a little bit different, but honestly, some of the substance is getting close as well and getting concerning to me. So how do you feel seeing the Premier of Ontario literally echoing campaign rhetoric from the federal conservative leader, the opposition leader?
Well, I read your op-ed. It was very good. I loved, I loved that you were talking about bruised, not broken, because I think that is so true. And I think that Poilievre is totally overstating the state that Canada's in. I think it's very interesting. I actually had not heard that Ford was using that language, because he has distanced himself from Pierre Poilievre. But, maybe that's going to start to shift now, because obviously Poilievre's numbers are very, very good across the country, and Ford is nothing if not an opportunist. He is going to go where the numbers are. He's going to go where the popularity is, and if he sees an opportunity with Poilievre, then he will be there. And that is very worrisome to me, because I do not think Pierre Poilievre's really simplistic solutions or non-solutions to complex problems will serve us in the long run at all. And Ford has, he's always done some of that. I mean, buck a beer, which, you know,
Right.
A, never materialized, and B, wouldn't have made any sense if it had. He has kind of traded in that kind of thing. And he
Stop the
doesn't,
gravy train. Stop the gravy train
yeah,
is 4 words though, so he's typing
yeah.
it, right.
He doesn't support the carbon tax, but he also doesn't have a decent climate change plan. So it doesn't surprise me. It does worry me. I also want to just go back to what you were talking about before. We were talking about before in terms of the centralizing of the power, because we talked about Alberta, but you know what worries me here in Ontario is that a lot of the things that they have done have given the ministers, to your point, ministers way more power than they should have. So a lot of the development issues that have meant that developers will have more access and they will have more power than citizens do. Issues in the justice system around the minister having more power to appoint judges and to influence the process. Those things are, they're not well, they are headlines, but they don't last for a long time, and people have lots of things going on in their lives. They may not pay attention to them, but honest to goodness, if you get into the justice system and somebody with a very negative bias against you is the judge, like that's a huge problem if you politicize the judicial system. So I think that in this province, the centralization of power, not just in the premier's office, but in the government, where historically we've been trying to move to less partisan, development, we've been trying to move to less partisan and more science-based planning. In the judicial system, trying to move away from partisanship, where 100 years ago, sure, there was lots of patronage, and we've over time tried to move away from that and put in place more objective processes. This government in Ontario is rolling a lot of that back and making the process more partisan, and we should all be worried about that, Laura.
Well, I think it's an erosion of democracy. I mean, the representative democracy that we've all come to take for granted, right? I mean, of course, because the op-ed, I juxtaposed Trump to Poilievre in terms of their tactics and their tenets in some case. Trump derangement syndrome has been filling up my feed this afternoon. But the reality is, this is a movement that we're seeing across the globe. It might not be coordinated tightly, but it's certainly being replicated, and they're using each other's tactics, right? And we can see this. Now, I'm not calling Poilievre, I'm not saying he's an authoritarian, but I am warning Canadians that, we have an authoritarian in the US in the form of Donald Trump, who has stated clearly what he plans to do. His 2025 plan is out there, right? It's very scary. And when we see language that replicates it, or we see tactics, or some of the histrionics that we saw at Parliament this past week, the fundraising off of that stuff, it's all very MAGA. It's very disturbing.
Yeah.
And then when you see Poilievre talk about his own laws, as opposed to saying the new laws we will look at as a parliament, what his laws, they're going to be constitutional, he says, but why are you calling them your law? What is that? That worries me, Kathleen.
He said they're going to be constitutional, but he also said he'll use whatever mechanisms he has to make sure his laws are passed. So, that's an allusion to the notwithstanding clause. And again, that is very worrisome, because it's not the way we have experienced government in this country, and the fact that this is a person who doesn't want to talk to everybody, doesn't even pretend to want to talk to everybody, and I'm talking about Poilievre here, he's very, very clear about who he will and won't talk to. And I mean, no government can talk to every single person. I'm not suggesting that,
Sure.
But being open to consulting with people who have the information. I mean, that's one of the things about the Ford government that has been so problematic. All through COVID, continuing now, decisions are made without talking to the people who are going to be most impacted, and whether that's teachers or whether it's nurses, whoever it is, if you don't talk to the people who are on the front line, you're going to make mistakes. So even the cell phone ban that, the government brought in schools, I'm in favor of it. I think it's a good idea. I think that's where we should go. But for heaven's sake, talk to the teachers about how it will work, and make sure that you have an idea of what the plan should be before you go out and make an announcement that sounds popular
Right.
and probably is, but if it doesn't work, then that creates more of a problem.
Well, I
Right?
spoke to it on radio several times in support of it because, duh, what parent wouldn't be? I have two
Yeah.
teenagers. My teenagers laughed out loud at the idea that teachers could possibly enforce it. They're like, Mom, they've been trying for years. It ain't going to work. Right. So,
Yeah.
to your point, but I mean, not consulting as a strategy, Kathleen,
Right.
is something that we see with governments that are moving away from democracy towards autocracy, consolidating of power, not consulting. I mean, yes, it has led to a lot of embarrassing reversals with the Ford government because they didn't know what they were doing clearly, and they've had to pull things
Right.
back. But they continue to do that. They continue to take more power, have less consulting, less transparency, right? So, I mean,
Mhm.
I think we can call out, and we must call out, when we see the encroachment of
Right.
autocracy, whether it's provincially, whether it's
Yeah.
federally, whether it's sporadically, whether it's systematically. I mean, I plan on calling it out. And that's what I did in the op-ed. I had to do the op-ed because I'm like,
Yeah.
somebody's going to call this stuff out. And I know other people are. But I mean, I don't think we have to tiptoe. This is not
No, I agree. I agree. I think it's really important. And one of the problems is, I don't know if you've asked, but you probably can't get Doug Ford to come on your podcast and actually explain
Mm.
what he's doing, right? And
I don't know if he knows me. I think he might have a clue who I am. He's mentioned
well,
me
I think
on the radio. But
his staff will know you.
oh
His
yeah,
staff know who you
I'm
are.
being a little facetious,
Yeah.
Kathleen. I've heard he's not a fan. That being said, I don't care. If he wanted to come on the O Show and talk to me, I'd be happy to have him on the program. And I would even extend that to Poilievre, because I've certainly said a number of things about him. Will they though? Why would they?
Well, and that's what I'm saying. The lack of willingness to do that and to talk to people who you don't agree with ideologically. It would have been like me not agreeing to have conversations with reporters or opinion writers from the Toronto Sun. I mean, how would that be okay? It's really important that we do talk about what we're doing with people who may not agree with us. And that worries me very much about this government. And as you say,
yeah,
the not consulting as a strategy is part of that. I'm going to make up my decision, make up my mind at Queen's Park with the people around me or the few people who, I trust. And then that's the decision. And that's why there have been so many reversals. That's why Ford has had to go in reverse so often, because he didn't do the work up front.
So, and let me just put a fine point on this, because in my former life as a journalist, I was foolish enough to moderate debates federally and otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's a tough gig. But the people showed up back then in the day, right? They all showed up. And in the last election cycle, where were the Conservatives? They weren't in the debates locally. So my concern is, whenever I see, and I haven't seen the Liberals do it so far, the NDP, if I did, I would call them out equally, that. I haven't, it's the Conservative parties that I'm seeing skipping the debates, which are the chance for local accountability. And they're consolidating even their debate performance in campaigns around the premier, who, as far as I know, is still game to show up on stage like he did with you and Andrea. But I mean, it's that erosion of our democratic norms is deeply troubling, because once we erode that, building it back in is going to take some leaders who are very dedicated, who want to come back in and put it all back together.
Well, that's right. And the problem is, Laura, that if it works, then they'll keep doing it, right? If not showing up works and people don't demand that they be present, then they will keep doing it, because it all comes down to, for many people in politics, it comes down to how many seats are we going to get? Are we going to win the election? I've heard people say, people who I love, I mean, members of the Liberal family, I've heard them say, the point of a political party is to win and to gain government. That's not the point for me. The point for me of a political party and being a politician is to get things done that are good for people, you know, and to bring my ideas to the table so that we can make change and we can move in a direction that is healthy for the people of the province. But if it's all about winning seats, and if, you know, if by not appearing you actually do better, that's a problem. I always, you know, when I was running locally, there would always be a couple of debates in high schools, you know, and I would always go. The NDP candidate sometimes would go, and the Green candidate would always go, you know, so there were always at least two of us on the stage. But I found, Laura, those to be some of the best conversations, because the room would be full of kids in grade 11 and 12, sometimes younger. And the questions that they asked were real questions. They hadn't read all the bump from all the parties. They actually had questions about climate change. They had questions about education, you know, about their own futures. And you might say, as a politician, well, why bother? Those kids couldn't vote. But I would always say, but their families vote, and they will vote. They'll be voting soon. And if I can, you know, plant the seed of why it's important to vote in those kids when they're 14 or 15, why wouldn't I do that? So anyway, again, another soapbox, but it is, you know, it is really, really important that we ask our politicians at the local level, because in this province, everybody has to get elected at the local level. And maybe that's where the pressure has to be applied. If we can ask them at the local level to show up and be part of the discussion, I think that's the best calling out that we can do, actually.
Well, but you know what, so I take your point, and your rant, your soapboxing is balm to my soul, you know, because you're promoting democracy. I didn't hear you say that you were promoting they vote Liberal their entire lives. You were trying to seed for democracy. And it's ironic, of course, your last name being Wynne, that winning is not your priority. And I remember you sharing with me on the last time you were on the show, Kathleen, that after Ford, you know, trounced you, he, instead of being gracious, he walked over and talked about another seat he was going to win in a by-election.
Exactly.
You're like, really? You know?
Exactly.
So, I mean, so he's into the game, he's into the numbers, he's playing that. And you mentioned his family business. His family business wasn't just the deco labels, it was also politics, right? Yeah. They had political pedigree in their family. So he came into all of this, and that's his right to execute, you know, how he does politics, how he wants. But where I get troubled is, even with that local engagement pressure you're advocating for here, when it was tried by local groups to get the Conservative candidates to show up, it was crickets, you know, because they're getting a directive that says it's not necessary. You don't need to defend our case locally. We've got this. And they were rewarded, Kathleen, with the seats, right?
I know.
So I mean, from the gaslighting, we talked about all this, you know, flooding the zone with all this Ontario's so great, don't worry about what we're really up to stuff, to consolidating power, to the ministers, the lack of transparency, the lack of participation in these democratic conventions, like debates, is very alarming. And I think in Canada, it's okay for us to say, what are we at risk of losing here? You know, whether you're a partisan, I'm not a partisan. I'm certainly more progressive than I am conservative, although I've been accused of being a conservative in the past, if you can believe it. But the idea that we are not challenging this stuff because we can't believe that it could really ever happen here is the exact problem the US is in right now, with like under 200 days to where they might actually lose their democratic experiment. So I'm glad we got into this conversation, and I appreciate that you read the op-ed, and I'll put it in the show notes for our audience here. Kathleen, you are an optimist. Always. Still somehow, after everything. So I'm not going to pretend that I am always an optimist, but I do want to leave our audience on something other than a dystopic OShow note. Is there something that you think our audience across Canada can kind of focus in on in this conversation in terms of what they can do to preserve and improve the country that we're in and the province that we're in?
Well, I think we may have talked about this in one of our previous conversations, but I was thinking about it as you were just talking there. We can't throw up our hands and say we've lost. You know, we can't abandon all those kids who want us to talk to them. We can't abandon the community groups and the individuals in our communities who want answers. And I know some of that happens on social media, Laura, but some of the most serious conversation happens face to face. It happens when you're knocking on doors, you know, and engaging with candidates. So I would just say that to the politicians in the crowd, you know, we have to keep doing that work. We have to keep seeing people face to face, and not just at the houses where we know we're going to get support. You know, we need to walk and talk, walk up the lane, walk down the hall of the apartment building and talk to the people who have said they may not support us or they don't support us, and just have a conversation about why that is. Because I know they're not all going to go to community meetings. Some of them will, and we need to show up at those. But we really need to talk to people who are not necessarily on the same page as we are, and try to understand each other and create opportunities for people to come together. I'm very worried, Laura, right now with the divide that's been created because of what's happening in the Middle East, you know, and the increasing lack of ability to actually reach across that divide and talk to one another. That should not be happening in Canada. And you know, I really hope that we figure that out soon, that, you know, we need to talk to each other about where we're coming from, because that has stopped happening in the States in a lot of places. You know, I've heard many people say Republicans and Democrats just don't talk to one another. Well, that's not how democracy succeeds and thrives.
And, you know, it's fascinating you said that. If you have just a couple more minutes, Kathleen, because I love talking to you, and you just tweaked me onto something. I was listening to a journalist talk about this autocracy movement around the world, and that it's not particularly coordinated in, you know, there's no like cabal meeting,
No.
but what they are doing is they are replicating things. And what they realized, and this was, I think, Anne Applebaum, she's a journalist, and she's highly acclaimed, and she just came out with this, and she was talking about the fact that they observed that since the Second World War, the world order was promoting democracy, right? The West was promoting democracy as a value, actively investing in countries through foreign policy, et cetera, promoting democratic values, tear down that wall, all that stuff, right? And about 10 years ago, there was an awareness that said, you know what, actually, autocracies are preferable for me as a powerful leader. I would rather have an autocracy. I'm not just going to leave it up to my local country to decide that that's the way they want to go. I'm going to actually export the autocratic governance structure, and doing it through investing in all kinds of places, buying up big media, conglomerates, putting this stuff out. So there has been an active promotion of autocratic values on social media and elsewhere. And, you know, that's different. It's a change.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that.
And there hasn't been a counterbalance to that, right?
Right.
And
which is what we're catching up to now, I think.
Yeah.
And talking about it is extremely important. And I want to thank you for being on the show, but I do have to break a little promise. I said I would leave it on a non-dystopic note, but I forgot to ask you, what do you think's going on with the RCMP investigation into Doug Ford? Like, is that ever happening, Kathleen?
I think it is. My understanding, I just heard, you know, you hear rumors, whatever. I'm not there. I don't know, but I did hear sort of second or third hand that some of the staff are being spoken with. I don't know, but the RCMP is not going to just let it go. They will, but who knows what'll come? Who knows what will come of it?
Well, I know when you said that there's another shoe to drop, people are still waiting.
I know, we all are. I want to say congratulations to you too. You're going national, right?
Yeah, we're taking this pod for people who are watching it on YouTube. They've always had access, but we're actually taking the pod in audio pod. It's going to be everywhere you find great podcasts. It might take a minute to be everywhere that you want to find the OShow, but we are having a national conversation now for all the reasons that we just discussed, Kathleen.
Awesome.
Need to have it.
Awesome.
Need to have it. So thank you for being a part of it, and for engaging with me. I never told you what the topics are going to be. You just go with it, which I love. It's like you're back with those high school students again. Just taking.
I love it.
Awesome.
Anytime.
Thanks for being on the OShow, and thank you for watching. Subscribe on YouTube and everywhere you get great podcasts. It's exciting to be part of the ACAST network, and we'll have a lot more coming up on the OShow. Thank you so much. Take care.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the OShow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the OShow. If you you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the OShow. It's the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the OShow. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the OShow. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call of the OShow. It's a podcast, the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. Stay informed with the OShow.